The Atlantic City waterfront never truly slept. Even past midnight, its salt-crusted boardwalks and dim yellow dock lights kept breathing with the quiet rhythm of people arriving, people leaving, and people waiting. Lena Ashford in that moment belonged to the last category, not by choice. She was sitting on a cold metal bench near Pier 14, back straight out of habit, her small overnight bag parked in front of her like a shield. Her phone, screen dead and battery at 0, sat useless in her right hand. She wouldn't let go of it. It was the only thing that still made sense to hold, even though it couldn't do a thing. She'd been like that for 35 minutes. 35 minutes since Bryce Ledger had looked at her outside the restaurant with that rehearsed calm she now found obscene, and told her it was over. 4 years erased in fewer words than it took to order dinner. She'd asked him if he was serious. He'd let go of her hand, grabbed his bag, and turned around. She'd followed. 2 steps. Just 2 steps. Before he stopped and looked back with something worse than cruelty. Total indifference. Lena, don't make this harder than it has to be. Then he'd walk to a black sedan that had been waiting at the curb, a car she hadn't known about, and disappeared without looking back once, as if she were part of the pier's furniture. Now she sat with everything unresolved, stacking silently on top of her. No money for a hotel because they'd always split expenses and her share barely covered a bus ticket back to Queens. No way to call anyone because her phone was dead and Bryce always kept the charger in his car. He'd calculated everything. Not the abandonment itself, but the conditions of the abandonment. And before her screen had died, she'd caught one notification from the hospital in Brooklyn. Her mother's payments were 72 hours overdue. Transfer to basic care pending. The screen had gone black before she finished reading. Lena closed her eyes, counted to 5 in Russian, to 5 in Arabic, to 5 in Italian. Different languages forced the brain to switch lanes. Exit the emotional loop. Enter analysis mode. 12 years she'd been using that trick. It was the most useful tool she had left. When she opened her eyes, a man was watching her. Not the way strangers sometimes watched. This was different, direct, but without impertinence. Like someone who'd recognized something and was deciding what to do about it. He stood about 7 meters away in a dark coat that fit like it cost more than her rent. Then he walked toward her. Stopped a meter away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough not to invade. "I saw what happened," he said in a voice that didn't ask permission but didn't impose. "I was finishing a meeting on the 2nd floor and I saw it from the balcony." He paused. "I saw how you stayed." He reached into his coat and placed a portable charger on the armrest beside her. "For the phone," he said simply. Lena looked at him. "Where are you going?" she asked, because it was the only question that made sense. "Washington," he said. "Federal energy negotiation." 3 seconds of silence. "So am I," she said. "Thane Calloway," he introduced himself without extending his hand. "Lena Ashford. Plug that in," he said. "And when you've got a minute of charge, call whoever you need to call." He stood beside her without sitting, without saying more, as if his presence alone was a way of saying he wasn't going anywhere yet. She plugged in the phone, and for the first time in 35 minutes, felt the ground return to where it belonged. When the screen flickered to life, Thane sat beside her, not facing her but looking in the same direction. "There's a room at the Willard," he said. "It's where my people stay. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just solving a logistics problem someone deliberately created so you wouldn't make it to that negotiation." "Why do you say deliberately?" "Because the man who left 35 minutes ago didn't forget the charger, or split the money by accident. He did it so you couldn't move. I've seen it done in my line of work. When someone wants you gone, they don't threaten you, they take away the tools." Her phone buzzed. A message from her sister Phoebe sent 28 minutes ago. "Lena, call me when you can. There's something you need to know about Bryce." Thane stood up. "My car leaves in 15 minutes, he said. "If you decide to come, I'll be at the black SUV at the end of the lot. If not, the charger's yours either way." He walked toward the lot without looking back, coat moving in the November wind, with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't need anyone to follow him to know where he was going. Lena looked at her phone, looked at the dark water, looked at the parking lot, then picked up her bag and walked after him. Not because she had no other option, but because for the first time in 4 years she was making a decision she hadn't consulted anyone about before taking it. If you enjoyed this story, drop a like and share it with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. And the journey truly began from there. The black SUV tore through the night on the Garden State Parkway heading south, then cut onto Interstate 95 toward Washington. Hendricks drove with the quiet of someone who was used to moving in darkness, without needing anyone to tell him the way. Lena sat in the back seat on the right, Thane on the left, the space between them just wide enough that no one had to explain why it existed. She held a phone with just enough battery left to work and dialed Phoebe. Her sister picked up before the second ring could finish. "Sis." Phoebe's voice shook, but not from sleep. "I've called so many times. Where are you?" Lena said she was on her way to Washington and didn't explain more, because she knew if she started talking about the port, her voice wouldn't hold the way it was holding now. Phoebe didn't ask why. Instead, she went straight to what she needed to say, in the voice of someone who'd spent an hour rehearsing the words to make them hurt as little as possible, while knowing there was no way to make them not hurt. "My friend, the one who's an assistant at Morrison & Kent in Manhattan, found Bryce Ledger's name in the internal payment records of a corporation directly linked to the Petrov family. Not once," Phoebe said, "but every month, for 4 years, steady money wired into an account under the name of a consulting company that Bryce was the sole owner of. The first payment started 3 months before he showed up at that law industry mixer where you met him for the first time." Lena remembered that night. She remembered Bryce walking up and introducing himself as a young commercial attorney who'd just moved from Boston back to New York, remembered him asking how many languages she spoke, with a kind of sincere surprise that made her smile, remembered how she'd thought that for the first time in her life someone actually cared about her work instead of just finding it strange. 3 months before that, someone had paid for him to stand in exactly that place at exactly that time and say exactly those lines. Phoebe kept going. "There's more, sis. My friend dug deeper because I asked her to check after you lost that DOJ contract 3 years ago. The anonymous complaint sent to internal oversight accusing you of a conflict of interest in interpretations connected to organized crime. It was sent from a temporary email address. But my friend traced the original IP. It matches the office address of Bryce's consulting firm." Lena didn't say anything. She listened to the tires on the road, the wind outside the glass, Phoebe breathing on the other end, waiting for her to react. 3 years ago, when oversight called her in and laid a thick 20-page file on the table, she hadn't understood what was happening. She'd sat in that windowless room for 3 hours answering every question with the calm of someone who knew she hadn't done anything wrong. And when they said it'd be better if she withdrew to avoid a drawn-out formal investigation, she'd nodded, because Bryce had been beside her then, holding her hand under the table and murmuring that he'd handle everything, that she didn't need that job, that she had him. She'd always thought she chose to leave. The truth was, she'd been pushed out by the very person holding her hand while he pushed. "Sis," Phoebe called softly. "I'm here," Lena said. Her voice was so flat she surprised even herself. "Are you okay?" Lena let the question sit for a second. "Phoebe, I'll call you back when I get there." She ended the call. The phone lay in her palm, warmer now than it had been at the port, but heavier by far, because now it held truth instead of silence. She didn't look at Thane. She knew he'd heard everything, because in this SUV, every sound carried, and she hadn't lowered her voice when she spoke to Phoebe, because when she dialed, she hadn't thought about anyone listening, only about needing to know the truth. Thane didn't comment, didn't turn his head, didn't ask if she wanted to say anything. He stared out his window, where highway signs slid past in the dark like numbers counting down to a place she didn't yet know, but had already decided to reach. And in that silence, between the steady engine and the sweep of highway lights that flashed and vanished, Lena put each piece back together in her mind with the precision that 12 years of interpreting had trained into her as a second instinct. The mixer hadn't been a coincidence. The relationship hadn't been love. The complaint hadn't come from a stranger. Leaving the DOJ hadn't been her choice. And tonight at the port hadn't been a goodbye, but the final step of a 4-year operation with a start date, a defined objective, and an approved budget, with only one person unaware she'd been living inside it. The SUV pulled up in front of the Willard Intercontinental at 3 o'clock in the morning. The lobby was empty. Soft golden light spread across the marble floor, the kind of light designed to make people forget what hour it was. Hendricks went ahead, said something to the receptionist without raising his voice, then came back and handed Lena a small envelope containing a room key, a delegation access card, and a brand new phone still sealed in its box. "Your old phone may be compromised," he said in a tone that offered no further explanation because the sentence itself was enough. "Use this one from now on." Lena looked at the phone in the box, looked at Hendricks, then looked toward Thane, who was standing a few yards away speaking with another hotel employee. He didn't look at her. There was no gesture saying "thank me" or "we'll talk later." He simply stood there handling what needed to be handled, then stepped into the elevator without turning back. Lena went up to the room alone. 6th floor, corner room, windows facing Pennsylvania Avenue and, farther out, the darkness where the National Mall lay swallowed by the night. She set her bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed for 3 seconds, then stood again, because if she sat any longer, she was afraid she wouldn't be able to get back up. She opened the new phone box, turned it on, transferred her number, and called Brooklyn Methodist Hospital. The automated system asked for the patient code. She entered each digit from memory because she'd called this line often enough to know it by heart. The night staff member answered after 2 minutes on hold. Lena asked about her mother's payment status. The employee checked, then said the entire overdue balance had been paid at 1:47 in the morning by a third party who requested anonymity. Lena said nothing. She didn't ask who had paid because she knew. 1:47 was when the SUV had been moving along, Interstate 95 through Delaware, and Thane had been looking out the window, tapping something on his phone before putting it away, and she'd thought he was checking email. She thanked the employee and ended the call. Standing by the window, she looked down at the empty street below, without really seeing anything at all. There was a man she'd met less than 4 hours ago, who had just paid her mother's hospital bill without saying a word, and there was a man she'd lived with for 4 years, who had deliberately cut every line so she couldn't call the hospital even when her mother was about to be transferred to basic care. She didn't cry. Not yet. She took the small notebook from her handbag, the notebook she'd carried everywhere for 12 years, because in interpreting memory was a weapon, but paper and pen were evidence. Then sat down by the window and began to write. Names, dates, the contracts Bryce had asked her to help translate over the past 3 years, the ones she'd done without asking questions because she trusted him. The Russian language contract she'd translated 18 months earlier, with the company name she hadn't noticed at the time but now remembered clearly, every letter of it. The phone calls in Russian that Bryce had said were wrong numbers from colleagues, though she'd heard enough to know those weren't the voices of people calling by mistake. The evenings he came home late and said meetings had run long while his clothes smelled of cigarette smoke, though he didn't smoke. She wrote each thing down in small, precise, emotionless handwriting, the same way she took notes in the most important interpretations of her career, because this was the most important interpretation of her life, translating the last 4 years she had lived in the language of someone else without knowing it. Her pen stopped when she reached the moment 3 years earlier. The windowless room at DOJ headquarters, where internal oversight had placed the 20-page file in front of her, and Bryce had been sitting beside her, his hand holding hers under the table, leaning close to whisper in the voice she'd once thought was the warmest in the world, "You don't need them. You have me." She had believed him. She had nodded. She had signed the voluntary withdrawal and walked out of that building with the feeling that at least she still had him after losing everything else. Now, sitting in a hotel room in D.C., at nearly 4 in the morning, she understood that those words hadn't been comfort. They had been a declaration of victory. Bryce had completed the mission, removed her from the system, cut her off from every professional connection, turned her from the DOJ's highest-level interpreter into a freelancer struggling to pay rent in Queens and carry her mother's hospital bills on the back of piecemeal contracts. And he'd said, "You have me," so she wouldn't go looking for anything else. Lena looked at what she had written. 4 pages, small, dense handwriting. 12 years of professional memory spilled onto paper in less than an hour. She closed the notebook, set down the pen, and looked out the window where D.C. lay still in the night, with pale white buildings in the distance like the ghosts of history asleep. Then she turned off the light, not because she was all right, but because tomorrow she needed to be awake, and she knew how to force herself to sleep when necessary, just as she knew how to force herself to stay calm in 3 languages on a dock at midnight. That was something Bryce hadn't taken from her, because he'd never known it existed. Lena came down to the dining room at 7 in the morning, after less than 3 hours of sleep, but her eyes were clear, and her back was straight, because her body had learned how to function on discipline when there was nothing else left to lean on. Thane was already seated at a corner table by the window overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, with black coffee and 3 open files in front of him. Hendricks stood near the dining room entrance with a cup of coffee in his hand, but his attention wasn't on the cup. It was on everyone who walked in. Thane saw her, gave a single nod, then indicated the chair across from him. Lena sat down. A server brought her coffee without waiting for her to order, the kind of service reserved for guests the staff had already been instructed about. Thane slid a plastic badge across the table. Technical Language Consultant, Callaway Holdings, with the name Lena Ashford printed beneath it, and a Level 1 access code. This badge gets you into every meeting room in the federal building today, he said. Lena picked up the badge, looked at her name on it, then set it back down. What time did you have this made? Hendricks handled it at 5 this morning, Thane replied. Because I need you in the negotiation room, not out in the hallway. Then he opened the first file and began to speak, not in the way someone explains things to an outsider, but in the way a man places pieces on a board so the person across from him can see the entire game. Federal Energy Infrastructure Contract. 5 international partners: Russia, Italy, Arabia, France, and the United States. 4 primary languages at the negotiating table. Total value, $300 million. If this contract is signed, then Callaway Holdings controls full energy distribution rights for the federal East Coast system for the next 10 years. If the contract collapses, is delayed, or is challenged for any reason at all, including an interpretation error, then under the contingency clause already signed in advance, all subcontracts automatically transfer to Petrov and his system. Lena listened without interrupting. She was used to hearing negotiations far more complicated than this during her 4 years at DOJ, without missing a word. Who recommended the current interpreter? She asked. Thane looked at her. Your listed contact representative did. 6 months ago. Lena set her coffee cup down more slowly than usual. You tried to hire me. Thane nodded. Hendricks reached out through the public number registered under your name. That number led to the person you listed as your contract management representative, Bryce Ledger. He answered on your behalf. Said you weren't taking new projects and had no interest in the energy sector. He signed the refusal in your name. You never knew. Lena looked out the window. The November morning in D.C. was gray and cold, the weak light not yet strong enough to erase the darkness from the buildings in the distance. 3 weeks after that refusal, Thane continued, Bryce Ledger signed an exclusive consulting contract with one of Petrov's subsidiaries, and 6 months after that, he left you at the Atlantic City port on the night before negotiations, so you'd have no way to get to D.C. The chain of events lay on the table between them, clear and complete as an exact translation, with no word left open to misunderstanding. Thane hired Lena, Bryce blocked it, Bryce signed with Petrov, Bryce abandoned Lena on the exact night she needed to disappear. Each step spaced just far enough apart that no one could see the full shape unless everything was placed side by side. Lena took a sip of coffee. It was still hot, but she didn't feel the temperature because her mind was processing something else. Then she looked straight at Thane with the same expression she used when facing officials in closed DOJ hearing rooms, the kind of look that didn't ask permission and didn't step back. I know who you are, she said. I looked you up on the new phone last night. Thane Callaway, Callaway Holdings on paper. But on the street and in the rooms the press never enters. It's a completely different name. Thane didn't answer right away. He looked at her with complete attention, not defensive, not explanatory, just waiting to see where she would go with what she had just said. And I'm still sitting here, Lena said, not because I don't have a choice. I could stand up right now, get a car back to Queens, go back to translating contracts for small law firms, and pay my mother's hospital bills month by month until I can't anymore. But I'm sitting here for 2 reasons. 1, interpretation is legal, and I'm better than anyone else you can find in the next 24 hours. 2, last night someone paid my mother's hospital bill at nearly 2 in the morning without saying a word and without asking for anything in return. She paused for a beat. Those 2 things tell me enough about the man I'm sitting across from. At least enough for today. Thane looked at her for 1 second longer. The kind of look from a man who had just received the answer he needed but hadn't dared expect to hear. Then he closed the first file and pushed the second one toward her. These are the main contract terms, he said. The review session starts at 9. You have 90 minutes. Lena opened the file and began reading at the speed 12 years in the profession had carved into her, fast but without missing anything, and Thane sat across from her drinking coffee in silence, not rushing her, not asking anything more, like a man who had placed the right piece in the right square and now only had to wait for the game to move on its own. They arrived at the federal building at 8:45. Hendricks drove the SUV into the lane reserved for delegations, the kind of entrance with no public signage, known only to people who'd been issued a code and told it existed. Thane stepped out first, Lena followed, and Hendricks came last, close enough to react within a second, but far enough that no one would assume he was security unless they needed to know. The main lobby was wide and cold, with a high ceiling, American flags on both sides, and white overhead light poured evenly across everything, making the world look sharper than it needed to be, as if the building itself were watching every person who walked in. Genevieve Harlan was waiting in the delegation reception area. She was about 48, with short hair, a gray suit cut to fit, and a professional smile that switched on at the exact moment Thane came into view. "Mr. Calloway," she said with warmth measured to the decimal, "it's a pleasure to welcome you back to Washington." Thane gave a brief nod, the nod of a man who didn't need a long greeting to understand exactly where he was. Genevieve's gaze slid to Lena so quickly that anyone not paying attention would have missed it. But Lena noticed, because 12 years of interpreting in rooms where every glance meant something had taught her that no look was accidental. "Your delegation has been assigned to the designated room," Genevieve said, then turned her eyes directly to Lena. "The technical consultant can wait in the registration area while we complete verification for the additional badge for the final additional member. Standard procedure for badges issued within 24 hours. Her voice was smooth and reasonable, the kind that would sound like routine if you didn't listen closely. But Lena listened closely, because that was what she did, and she heard what sat underneath the reasonableness, an instruction wrapped in politeness to separate her from Thane before she entered the negotiation room. Hendricks stepped forward before Lena could answer. "What's the verification case code?" he asked in a voice completely flat. Genevieve looked at him. "That's an internal process. Every additional verification must generate a case code in the system before it can proceed," Hendricks said. "Article 14 of the Federal Negotiation Security Regulations. No code means no valid process. Miss Ashford's badge was approved by the negotiation secretariat this morning at 5 o'clock. I have the confirmation here if you'd like to see it." He didn't raise a phone. He didn't pull out paperwork. He simply spoke, and the precision of every word he chose was enough to make everyone within 3 yards understand this wasn't an exchange you could win with a smile. Genevieve looked at Hendricks, looked at Thane, looked at Lena. The smile remained, but her eyes had changed, thinner, colder, like the eyes of someone who'd flipped a card and realized it wasn't the one she needed. "There must have been a misunderstanding," she said. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Then she turned away. Lena watched her and saw exactly what she'd been waiting to see. Genevieve took out her phone before she'd walked 5 steps, her thumb moving fast across the screen with the urgency of someone informing another person that the plan wasn't unfolding as expected. She didn't look down while she typed, the kind of messaging only people who'd texted the same number enough times could do without looking. Lena stored it, not in her notebook, because it was in her bag right now and she didn't want anyone to see her writing. She stored it in her head, where 12 years of professional memory had built her a vault no one could access but her. They moved down a long corridor lined with oak doors and brass nameplates, turned left into the main negotiation wing. The room was large, high ceiling, a long rectangular table at the center with leather chairs for the delegation heads. Technical areas along both sides about 3 meters from the interpreting podium, close enough to hear every breath from the person at the podium, far enough to stay outside the room's direct focus. Hendricks guided Lena to her position in the left technical area, where she had a clear line of sight to the interpreting podium and the entire negotiation table. From here, she could see everything without being the center of anything. The official interpreter was already seated at the podium. Lena looked at him for the first time and began to read him the way she read everyone in every room she'd ever walked into, with her ears, her eyes, and the 6th sense 12 years in the profession had forged in her, the kind no school could ever teach. The negotiation session opened at exactly 9. Lena sat in the technical area with her notebook open on her lap, a pen in her hand, doing the one thing she was better at than anything else in the world. She listened. Kirk Alderman went to work the moment the head of the U.S. delegation delivered the opening statement. He was about 43, headphones looped around his neck, a tablet set beside an already open notebook. He held a pen, but he didn't write the way a trained interpreter wrote, fast key phrases to anchor memory while the ear kept listening. Instead, he kept glancing down at the notebook, then up, then down again, like someone checking against something pre-written rather than recording what he was hearing. Lena didn't rush. She let the first 2 hours pass with nothing but listening, because in this profession, patience wasn't a virtue. It was a weapon. An untrained ear would hear Kirk's interpretation and think it was fine. He moved smoothly between English, French, and Italian at an acceptable pace, and his pronunciation carried no major faults. But Lena wasn't listening to decide whether it was fine. She was listening for the places where it wasn't fine while pretending to be fine. and she found them. First, every time the Russian delegation spoke in Russian about technical provisions related to distribution infrastructure, Kirk simplified, not by translating completely wrong, but by translating close enough, replacing precise terms with more generic ones, the kind of generic language no one would notice in everyday speech, but that, in contract language, could be the difference between a binding commitment and a statement of intent. Second, when the Arab delegation spoke in formal Arabic, Kirk stripped out the legal nuance carried inside the sentence structure. Formal Arabic holds legal weight in verb conjugations and in the placement of prepositions, details that can be omitted while the translation still reads cleanly, but has lost its legal spine. Kirk removed those details systematically, not because he didn't know them, but because he knew exactly which ones to remove. That wasn't incompetence. It was incompetence by design. Lena stored both observations in her head first, out of habit, the habit of someone who kept information where no one else could reach it, and only then wrote them into her notebook in small handwriting. But what made her truly pause was Kirk's own notebook. From the technical area 3 meters away, she had an angled view of the interpreting podium, and when Kirk opened the notebook fully at the start of the second interpreting block, Lena saw what was inside. It wasn't interpreting notes. There were no key phrases, no arrows linking ideas, no shorthand symbols from the standard note-taking system every properly trained interpreter used. Instead, there were vertical columns, each column a set of clause numbers, and beside some of those clause numbers were marks in red ink. From that distance, she could read 4 clause numbers. Clause 3 was unmarked. Clause 5 was unmarked. Clause 7 was highlighted yellow. Clause 9 was marked in red. Dark red, underlined. Lena looked from the notebook to Kirk. He was interpreting the French delegation with an appropriately focused expression, but his left index finger rested on the page, right beside Clause 9, holding the place. He wasn't interpreting. He was waiting. Lena lowered her eyes to her own notebook and wrote 4 words in the smallest handwriting she could manage. Clause 9. Red mark. Then she underlined it twice. It happened at the beginning of the 3rd hour, just after the Italian delegation had finished its remarks, and the negotiation room settled into a brief silence between sessions. Kirk reached for the glass of water on the podium, and as his eyes swept across the room with the reflex of someone who had just finished a long block of interpretation, his gaze met Lena's. Just for a second, but that second was enough. He didn't recognize her in the ordinary way, not by face or by name. He recognized her the way people in a very small profession recognize one another. By the way she sat, by the way she held her pen, by the notebook open on her lap with the kind of notation only a high-level professional interpreter would use, and most of all by the way she was looking at him, not watching, but reading every movement of his hand, every pause in his rhythm, every time he glanced down at the notebook marked in red. Kirk knew that someone in this room understood exactly what he was doing. His expression didn't change. That was the first thing Lena noted, because it told her he wasn't an amateur. An ordinary interpreter who felt someone's scrutiny would have looked away or grown uneasy. Kirk did neither. He turned back to his tablet with complete normalcy, but his right hand shifted, not toward his pen or his notebook, toward the tablet, and his finger moved quickly across the screen with the rhythm of someone sending a message, not checking a document. Lena didn't need to see the content to know he was notifying someone. She knew because she had seen Genevieve Harlan texting with that same blind, practiced movement in the lobby that morning. The two of them were using the same communication channel. 2 minutes later, Genevieve appeared at the aisle beside the negotiation room. She wasn't alone. 2 federal building security officers followed behind her, dressed in black suits, identification badges clipped to their chests, their faces expressionless in exactly the way security personnel were trained to keep them. Genevieve walked straight toward the technical area where Lena was seated. "Miss Ashford," she said in a low voice, but one clear enough for the 2 security officers to hear. "There's been an issue with your access badge. The security system requires additional verification for badges issued outside standard procedure. I need you to come with me to the administrative area to complete it. No more than 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Lena calculated it in her head faster than she had calculated almost anything in her life. The clause-by-clause review before signing was scheduled to begin in exactly 20 minutes, according to the agenda she had read in the file Thane gave her that morning. 20 minutes was precisely the amount of time needed to get her out of the room before Kirk carried out whatever was marked in red in his notebook. Not a coincidence. Nothing had been a coincidence since Bryce stepped into that black sedan at the port. Lena opened her mouth to answer, but she didn't need to. Hendricks was already there. She hadn't seen him move, because Hendricks moved in the way the human eye often failed to catch, like a shadow changing position when the source of light shifts, silent and impossible to stop. "What's the case code for the additional verification?" Hendricks asked. His voice wasn't louder than usual, but it carried the weight of stone, the kind of weight that told anyone listening not to test it. Genevieve looked at him. "That's an internal procedure of the building security system. Miss Ashford's badge was approved by the negotiation secretariat at 5 o'clock this morning," Hendricks said. "The approval code was confirmed in the federal system before 8. Any additional verification after that point requires its own case code generated in the system before it can proceed. Article 14. Do you have a case code?" It wasn't a question. It was a wall. Genevieve looked at Hendricks, looked at the two security officers behind her, who now seemed less certain than they had when they were first called over, because they knew Article 14 too, and they knew the man standing in front of them understood it better than they did. Then Genevieve looked into the negotiation room where Thane sat at the main table, not looking in their direction. But that refusal to look was its own message, because it meant he didn't need to look to know Hendricks was already finishing the matter. "There must have been a misunderstanding," Genevieve said. This time her voice wasn't smooth. It was flat, dry, like the voice of someone who had just laid a card on the table and watched it get taken cleanly. "Sorry for the disturbance." She turned away. The two security officers followed, their shoulders a little lower than when they had arrived. And this time, as Genevieve walked off, she didn't send a message. She held the phone tightly in her hand without opening the screen, the way a person holds it when she knows the next message she sends won't be good news for anyone waiting on the other end. The professional smile didn't return. Lena watched her go, then looked back down at the notebook on her lap. Their plan A had just failed twice in one morning, which meant there would be a plan B. And plan B was sitting inside the red marked notebook on the interpreting podium, right beside Kirk Alderman's index finger holding the place at Clause 9. Lena needed water. She had been sitting in the technical area for more than 2 hours without standing once, and her throat was dry, but that wasn't the real reason she got up. The real reason was that she needed 30 seconds outside the negotiation room to put everything in her head back into order before the clause review began. She picked up her handbag, rose with the ordinary movement of someone going to get water, not someone carrying 4 pages of notes that could overturn a $300 million negotiation, then stepped into the side hallway where the water and coffee station served the badge access area. The corridor was empty. Most people were either in the negotiation room or in adjoining conference rooms preparing for the afternoon session. Lena poured water into a glass, and that was when she heard the voice, not because she had been trying to listen, but because that was what her ears had done since she was 15. Ever since she discovered she could separate one voice from surrounding noise and register it before her mind had even decided whether it wanted to hear it or not. Bryce had once said that trait made people uneasy around her at dinner parties. Now she understood he hadn't said it because he was worried about her. He had said it because he was worried about himself. The voice came from behind the half-closed door of an adjoining room about 4 meters away. A woman's voice. Russian. Fast, tense, low-pitched but not whispered. The kind of voice used by someone who believed she was alone in the room and was passing along information that could not be repeated. Lena stayed still, glass in hand. She didn't turn her head, didn't lean, didn't do anything that would make anyone who saw her now think she was doing anything other than waiting for a glass to fill. And she listened. "It's not working," the woman said in Russian. "She can't be separated. Calloway's team is protecting her. Case code. Article 14. They know the procedure. Harlan tried twice. Both times failed." A pause. The woman was listening to instructions from the other end. Then she continued. "Understood. Then Plan B proceeds. Clause 9. Review session. Alderman is ready. But if she's still in the room when Alderman executes, the risk of detection doubles. Request confirmation to proceed or cancel." A longer silence than before. Lena counted in her head. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. Then the woman spoke again, this time half a tone lower. But Lena still heard every syllable clearly, because Russian was one of the 6 languages she spoke, and she didn't need to translate it in her head. She understood it directly, the way she understood her mother tongue. "Understood. Proceed." Then the woman added one final sentence. And that sentence made the glass in Lena's hand feel many times heavier, though the amount of water in it had not changed. If the agreement is signed, Calloway lives. If not, handle it. Handle it. That word in Russian, in that voice, in that context, had only one meaning. And Lena knew that meaning, because she had spent 4 years in DOJ, closed hearing rooms, interpreting testimony from people who used that exact word when they were talking about that exact thing. This wasn't just contract sabotage. This was a conditional kill order. The sound of heels moved away from the adjoining room. The door closed fully. Lena stood beside the water station for 5 seconds longer, took a slow sip of water, because if anyone saw her right now, she needed to look like a woman who had just had a drink, not a woman who had just overheard an assassination order. Then she returned to the technical area, sat down, opened her notebook, wrote every word she had just heard, exactly in order, nothing added, nothing removed, in Russian transliterated into Latin script, so Hendricks could read it, and beneath that, she wrote the English translation. Then she tore out the page, folded it, and added a separate note in tiny handwriting on the outside. Female voice, native Russian, not learned accent, not Harlan, because Harlan doesn't speak Russian. I've heard Harlan speak twice this morning, and she only used English and French. There is a third person in this building. She passed the folded page to Hendricks when he moved past the technical area with the steady walk of a man on patrol, who looked as if he were only going for coffee. He took the paper without breaking stride, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and kept walking as though nothing had happened. Lena looked toward the interpreting podium. Kirk was checking his tablet with the concentrated look of a man waiting for confirmation. 2 minutes later, his expression shifted slightly, almost too subtly to notice unless someone had been watching him continuously for 2 hours the way Lena had. A message had arrived. An instruction had been received. Plan B was still in motion, and the clause review was beginning in less than 30 minutes. The clause review hadn't even begun when the side door on the left of the negotiation room opened. Lena saw him before he saw her. Bryce Ledger stepped in wearing the suit he used for business trips. His tie loosened more than usual, the way it always was when he hadn't slept enough, and the expression on his face, the one she had lived beside for 4 years and could read instantly, the expression of a man arriving to fix something that had broken outside the plan. His eyes swept the room in an order Lena registered step by step, because that order told her exactly who he feared most. First he saw Thane at the main table, and his shoulders tightened for half a second. Then he saw Hendricks standing in the side corridor opposite, and his jaw locked. Then he saw Lena seated in the technical area 3 meters from the interpreting podium, tablet in hand and notebook open on her lap, and everything on his face changed at once. He hadn't expected her to be here. He had calculated the conditions at the port to make sure she couldn't get here. No money, no charger, no car, no one to call, and yet she was sitting here, inside a federal negotiation room, 3 meters from the interpreting podium, with a level 1 access badge hanging around her neck. Bryce walked straight toward her. He didn't run, didn't rush, but his steps had the clear purpose of a man trying to reach a place before anyone could stop him. He didn't make it. Thane rose from the main table, not abruptly, not dramatically. He simply stood and stepped into the aisle Bryce was using to reach Lena. He didn't fold his arms. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. But the space around him tightened in the way Lena had already recognized the night before at the port, the way Thane Calloway's physical presence occupied more room than his body should have allowed, not because he was large, but because everything in him, from his eyes to the way he settled his weight onto both feet, said the same sentence, and that sentence was that he didn't need to move another inch to control everything within a 3-meter radius. Bryce stopped. "I need to speak to Lena," he said. "The negotiation starts in 10 minutes. Thane replied. His voice wasn't cold and it wasn't threatening. It was simply truth, spoken in the voice of a man for whom truth was the only thing he allowed to exist in this room. "She's working." Bryce looked over Thane's shoulder toward Lena. His eyes searched for hers out of 4 years of habit. The habit of seeking agreement, obedience, blind trust. The endless trust she had once given him without limit. "You don't know what you're getting involved in," Bryce said. His voice dropped lower, but still enough for Lena to hear. The kind of voice he used when he wanted her to believe he was protecting her. The kind of voice she had believed every time she heard it for the last 3 years. Lena looked at him. Looked straight at him. Not over Thane's shoulder, but through the empty space beside it. Because she didn't need anyone shielding her to face this man anymore. For the first time in 3 years, I know exactly what I'm doing, she said. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was simply flat, with the precision of someone who had spent 12 years choosing every word so that nothing was extra, nothing was missing, and every word carried exactly the weight it needed to carry. Something moved across Bryce's face. Not regret. Lena had lived with him long enough to know he didn't possess that. It was the quick calculation of a man realizing the board had changed, and he no longer had enough pieces left to keep playing. Hendricks had moved while they were speaking. He didn't go toward Bryce. He walked to the side door. Bryce had just come through and said something to someone outside in a low voice Lena couldn't quite hear from this distance. 10 seconds later, a federal building security officer appeared at the side door. "Mr. Ledger," the officer said, "please come with me." Bryce looked at the security officer, looked at Hendricks, looked at Thane, then looked at Lena one last time. And before he turned away, he tilted his head toward her just enough so only she could hear, and said in the whisper she knew was his real voice, not the one he had performed for 4 years, "They won't leave you alone." Then he followed the security officer out through the side door. He didn't look back. For the second time in less than 24 hours, he turned his back on her and walked away. But this time it wasn't because he chose to go. It was because he was being removed, and this time Lena didn't follow. She didn't rise. She didn't watch him leave. She turned back to the notebook on her lap, opened to the exact page where she had been writing, lowered her pen to the paper, and continued the line she had left unfinished before Bryce walked in, because the clause review began in 10 minutes, and Clause 9 was waiting, and she was not going to let anyone, not even the ghost of the last 4 years walking through that door, take those 10 minutes from her. The clause review began at 11:30. The chair read each clause aloud. The delegation representatives confirmed their understanding, and Kirk interpreted. Clause 1 passed. Clause 2 passed. Clauses 3, 4, and 5 passed without issue. Clause 6 passed. Kirk rendered Clause 7 with a slight simplification that Lena noted, but it still wasn't serious enough to act on. Clause 8 passed. Then came Clause 9, the compensation clause for breach of supply obligations, the heaviest clause in the entire contract, the one Kirk's notebook had marked in dark red and underlined. The Russian delegation representative read the confirmation in Russian. Kirk took a breath, opened his notebook to the marked page, and translated into English for the negotiating table. Lena listened. Every word, every syllable. The original Russian stated clearly that in the event of a breach of supply obligations due to the fault of the supplying party would bear the full amount of compensation at the rate agreed upon in the contract. Kirk's English version said that in the event of early cancellation of the contract by the purchasing party would bear the full amount of compensation at the rate agreed upon in the contract. One word changed the subject. One phrase reversed the obligation. The supplying party in breach became the purchasing party canceling the contract. The party at fault became the party being punished. $300 million moved from the pocket of the violator to the pocket of the injured side. And no one in the room caught it, because Kirk delivered it with the perfect fluency of a man who had practiced that sentence until it sounded as natural as truth. The delegations nodded. The advisors glanced at their copies. The Russian representative nodded because he heard his own Russian and trusted that the English said the same thing. Lena tore a page from her notebook, wrote 4 words, folded it. Clause 9, paragraph 3, Russian. She passed it to Hendricks by placing it on the edge of the technical table as he walked by. Hendricks took it without slowing down, crossed the room with an ordinary stride, and placed the folded page beside Thane's coffee cup at the main table. Thane read it. His eyes didn't change. No flinch, no frown, no reaction anyone watching him could read. He simply looked up and toward the technical area where Lena was seated. She gave a single nod. He raised his hand. "Mr. Chair, I request a technical recess." The chair looked at him. "How long, Mr. Calloway?" 15 minutes. Genevieve Harlan stepped forward from the corridor as if she had already been standing there waiting for this exact moment. "Mr. Chair, if there is a technical objection to the translation, procedure requires a formal submission through the review committee, and that process may take several days. Procedure also allows any accredited delegation member to request immediate public verification of a translation during session," Thane replied without looking at Genevieve. "That is my right under Article 18. I am exercising that right." The chair nodded. 15-minute recess. The room broke into murmurs. Kirk removed his headset. Genevieve took out her phone. Hendricks had already moved. Within 3 minutes, he returned to the technical area with a tablet open to the original Russian text of the contract. The exact Clause 9. The exact Paragraph 3. Lena read. Her finger moved across each Russian line with the speed of someone who didn't need to translate in her head but read directly. Exactly as I described, she said. Hendricks nodded. Thane came to the technical area. Are you sure? He asked in a low voice. Completely, Lena replied. What do you need? The original Russian and a microphone. The recess ended. The chair called for order. Thane stood. Mr. Chair, I would like to introduce Lena Ashford, an interpreter with 12 years of experience in federal negotiations. Former contract interpreter for the United States Department of Justice, specializing in transnational organized crime, fluent in 6 languages, English, Spanish, Russian, Italian, Arabic, and French. Ms. Ashford has identified a discrepancy in the translation of Clause 9 and requests verification before this session proceeds. Silence. 200 people turned toward the technical area where Lena was rising to her feet. She stepped out of the technical section, crossed 3 meters of polished wood floor to the interpreting podium. She had not stood in this position in 3 years, but her body remembered the distance to the microphone, the posture, the breathing rhythm. Everything came back automatically, like a language no one ever truly forgets, even after years of silence. She set the tablet on the podium. Her hand gripped the edge of the podium for 1 second before she spoke. No one in the room saw it because they were looking at her face. Only Thane saw because he wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hand, and he understood that it wasn't that she wasn't afraid. She was afraid and was standing here anyway. Clause 9, she began, her voice clear and even. Paragraph 3. The compensation clause for breach of supply obligations. The original Russian reads as follows. She read the Russian aloud, slowly, precisely, with the pronunciation of someone who spoke the language from within rather than from outside it. Translated into English according to the exact text, that sentence means, in the event of a breach of supply obligations due to the fault of the supplying party bears the full compensation at the agreed rate. She stopped for exactly the right beat, long enough for the room to absorb each word. The translation presented before this session 20 minutes ago was, in the event of early cancellation of the contract by the purchasing party bears the full compensation at the agreed rate. She looked out across the room. The discrepancy is not minor, and it is not technical. In the original, compensation belongs to the party that fails to perform the supply obligation. In the translation, compensation belongs to the party that cancels the purchase. Those are 2 different parties, 2 different obligations, and 2 completely opposite economic consequences. The difference between the 2 versions in the context of this contract is approximately $300 million. The room stayed silent for 3 seconds. The longest 3 seconds Lena had ever counted in her life. Then it shattered. The Russian delegation in Russian, the Arab delegation in Arabic, the Italian delegation in Italian, the French delegation in French, the American delegation in English. 5 languages at once, and Lena could hear all 5. The Russian delegation representative was the first to stand. Mr. Chair, we request immediate verification of Clause 9 with our delegation's own translation team. His words were in English, but their weight was Russian, heavy, slow, and leaving no space for anyone to cut in. Before the chair could respond, the Arab delegation representative stood as well, speaking in formal Arabic, and then translating himself into English, because at this point he didn't trust anyone to speak for him. We request a review of the entire Arabic translation from this morning's sessions, not only Clause 9, because if one clause can be altered, there is no reason to believe the others have not been. The chair struck the gavel twice. The requests are noted. The signing is postponed until verification is complete. Then everything moved fast. Kirk Alderman rose from the interpreting podium. He opened his mouth as if he meant to say something, maybe an objection, maybe an explanation. But the chair had already issued the order, and 2 federal security officers were positioned on either side of the podium, as if they had known in advance they would need to stand there. Mr. Alderman, please step outside while the committee conducts verification. Kirk scanned the room once, looked at Lena standing at the podium where he had just been seated, looked at the red marked notebook still open on the table. Then he walked out with the 2 security officers without saying a word, because he was smart enough to know that any word he spoke right now would go on the record. But before Kirk left the podium, Hendricks acted. Lena didn't see him move up to the podium because her eyes were on the room, but when she turned back, Hendricks was already beside the interpreting table with a phone in his hand, and he had already taken 3 photos. The notebook opened to the red-marked page, the tablet with the message screen not yet dark, and a slip of handwritten notepaper tucked under the notebook that Lena hadn't been able to see from the technical area, but Hendricks had seen because he was standing right over it. 3 photos in less than 5 seconds, before security could clear the interpreting station. Physical evidence was already in Hendricks's phone before anyone could erase anything. The negotiation room was now a block of orderly chaos, the kind of chaos powerful people make when they realize they were seconds away from being deceived. Legal advisors opened laptops. Delegation heads spoke urgently to one another in at least 4 languages at once. The court reporter typed without stopping. And at the left corridor door, Genevieve Harlan was leaving, not running, walking quickly but controlled. The walk of someone trying to look like she was going to handle work, rather than walking away from a scene. But she didn't make it past the doorway. 2 people stood there, 1 man and 1 woman. Black suits, identification badges different from building security, the kind with smaller lettering and a different seal that Lena recognized instantly because she had seen it hundreds of times during her 4 years at DOJ, Federal Oversight Committee badges. "Miss Harlan," the woman said, "the Oversight Committee needs to speak with you." Genevieve stopped. She looked at the 2 agents, looked toward the negotiation room where the chair was announcing an internal investigation effective immediately, looked toward Hendricks standing near the interpreting podium, with a phone holding 3 photos she knew exactly the contents of. And for the first time that day, Genevieve Harlan's face held no smile at all. Not professional, not forced, nothing. Only the blankness of a person who understood that every exit in this room had just closed at the same time. The negotiation room lost half the afternoon to verification and rearrangement. The Russian delegation's private translation team confirmed the Clause 9 discrepancy within 15 minutes. The Arab delegation took longer because they demanded a full review of the entire morning's Arabic interpretation and found 3 additional places where Kirk had stripped away legal nuance from the Arabic, not as serious as Clause 9, but enough to confirm that this wasn't an accidental error. It was a system. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the chair reconvened the session. The signing was rescheduled for 4 o'clock with 1 single change. "We need a new interpreter," the Russian delegation representative said. "And we propose Miss Ashford." The Arab representative nodded. "Our delegation agrees." The Italian representative looked at Thane, then at Lena, then said in Italian, with every word landing clearly in Lena's ears, "The Italian delegation supports the proposal." 3 delegations named the same person in less than a minute. The chair recorded it. "Miss Ashford, do you accept the role of official verifying interpreter for this afternoon's signing session?" Lena looked at the chair. "I accept," she said. In the stretch between 2 and 4, 3 things happened, and Lena remembered each of them separately. First, the Russian representative came to find her in the break area. He spoke Russian from the very first sentence as a gentle test, and Lena recognized it immediately because she had encountered that kind of test hundreds of times in her career. She answered in Russian without hesitation, without pausing to search for a single word, with the kind of pronunciation that, once he heard it, changed his posture. He stood straighter, more serious, like a man who had just confirmed that the person in front of him deserved a higher level of respect than the one he had been giving. "What you did today was priceless," he said in Russian. "Literally. Our team checked 3 times and still didn't catch it." "The trick is knowing what to look for," Lena replied. "When the person designing the mistake knows the original text, the mistake always hides in the place the reader feels most certain everything is correct." He looked at her for another second, then nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had just met a real colleague rather than a social acquaintance. Second, the Arab representative came afterward. He spoke formal Arabic from beginning to end, never once switching into English, and they spent 10 minutes discussing the legal weight carried in Arabic verb conjugations, the difference between obligation and recommendation when a single preposition changes, and the way Kirk had systematically removed those exact prepositions all morning. He listened with the attention of a man who had been searching for this conversation for a very long time. When it ended, he said, "Next quarter there are 3 conferences involving Middle Eastern energy contracts. All 3 require formal Arabic at the highest level, and all 3 need someone like you." Lena noted it and thanked him. Third, the Italian representative came, and his exchange was the briefest of all. He spoke in Italian. "Do you have a business card?" Lena paused for a beat. "No," she said. "I don't have a business card." For the last 3 years, someone else had managed every professional contact in her life, and she had no card bearing her own name. That sentence existed in 6 languages, and not one of them could fully translate what it meant. "I'll send you my contact information tomorrow," she said. He nodded and left. From where he sat a few yards away, Thane watched all 3 of those exchanges without stepping in, without coming closer, without doing anything except typing something into his phone, with an expression that anyone who didn't know him would have called ordinary. But Lena had watched him enough by now to recognize that it was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on Thane Calloway's face. At 4 in the afternoon, the signing session began with an atmosphere completely different from the morning. Heavier, slower, more awake. The kind of atmosphere that belongs to people who have just barely escaped being deceived and now know the cost of every word on the table. Lena stood at the interpreting podium. She read each clause in 5 languages, slowly, clearly, precisely, with the calm of someone who knew that every word she spoke had real consequences for real people, in places that would never make the news but would live with whatever was signed this afternoon. The Russian representative nodded as he heard the Russian with the expression of a man finally hearing the thing he had been waiting to hear. The Arab representative closed his eyes for a moment when the Arabic sections came, the way a musician closes his eyes when the melody is finally what it is supposed to be. Thane watched her for 2 hours from the main table, not with the surprised gaze of a man seeing something impressive, but with the gaze of a man who understood the true value of what was happening in front of him and knew he would not forget it. The contract was signed at 6:15 in the evening. The chair declared the session concluded. The room applauded out of protocol. Lena stepped down from the podium with the same composure she had carried when she stepped up, without celebration, without searching for anyone's eyes, with the quiet of someone who had done what needed to be done and knew that was enough. The rooftop restaurant at the Willard overlooked the National Mall at night, with yellow lights reflected along both sides of the water and the darkness, where the Washington Monument stood like a thin blade of light cutting across the sky. A table beside the glass. Just 2 people. No files, no tablet, no folders opened on the table. Hendricks stood outside the restaurant door, close enough to reach them in 3 seconds if needed, but far enough that the conversation inside belonged to the 2 people seated by the window. Lena ordered fish and water. Thane ordered steak and whiskey. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that belongs to 2 people who have just lived through a day most people will never experience in an entire lifetime and need a few minutes to let it settle before saying anything at all. Lena spoke first. She asked him about the difference between translation and interpretation, because it was a safe question, and because she wanted to see how Thane Calloway talked when there wasn't a $300 million contract sitting on the table between them. He listened, then answered with a question of his own. "So when you stood at the podium and read Clause 9 in 5 languages, were you translating or interpreting?" Lena thought for a second. "I was telling the truth in 5 different ways so no one could pretend they didn't understand." Thane gave a slight nod, and in that nod, Lena realized he hadn't asked out of politeness. He had asked because he genuinely wanted to know the answer. They talked about Washington in winter, about the Potomac River that Lena had seen from her room window late the night before, about how that river never froze completely, no matter how far the temperature dropped, because the current beneath it was too strong. "Some things look silent from the outside," Lena said, "but inside they never stop moving." And she wasn't talking entirely about the river. Then she asked the question she had wanted to ask since the night before at the port. "That night, before you knew who I was, before Hendricks verified anything, why did you walk toward me?" Thane didn't answer right away. He turned his whiskey glass once in a slow circle on the table, the movement of a man choosing between the safe answer and the honest one, and deciding which of the 2 to give her. Then he chose, "Because I saw someone sitting alone in the worst moment of her day and not collapsing," he said. "You were counting in 3 languages, completely alone, on a bench at the port at midnight." He paused. "In my world, the person who keeps calm after losing everything is the most dangerous person in the room, and I respect that kind of danger." Silence. The sound of silverware from a distant table. The lights of the National Mall below. "Was there any other reason?" Lena asked, because she knew there was. Thane looked at the whiskey in his glass. "My father was killed when I was 23, he said. His voice didn't change in tone, but its rhythm slowed slightly. The kind of slowing that comes when someone opens a room he doesn't let people enter very often. He was betrayed and killed by his closest ally. That man had dinner at our house every Sunday for 10 years. He stopped. Since that day, I've hated betrayal more than anything else in the world. More than enemies. Because enemies at least don't pretend to love you before they act. And that night at the port, when I saw that man do what he did to you, I recognized that kind of betrayal. Not because I knew the details, but because I knew its shape. Lena listened and said nothing for several seconds, because she understood that what Thane had just given her wasn't information. It was trust. And trust from a man like him weighed more than any $300 million contract. There's something else I want to say, Lena said. You paid my mother's hospital bill. Thane neither confirmed it nor denied it. He only looked at her, waiting for her to continue. That was kindness, Lena said, and I suspect you don't want anyone to know you possess that. Thane looked at her longer than at any point in the last 24 hours. It wasn't the look of judgment or calculation. It was the look of a man who had just been named correctly in the place he hid most carefully. And instead of feeling exposed, he felt seen. You're the first person in 13 years to say that word to me and make me not want to argue with it, he said. A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, just two people sitting beside a wall of glass looking out over a sleeping city, both of them knowing that something between them had shifted and neither of them needed to name it, because naming it now would have made it smaller than what it truly was. Thane took a sip of whiskey. Lena drank her water. Below them, the National Mall lay still in the November night, and somewhere in the distance the Potomac kept moving, never frozen, never completely frozen no matter how cold it became outside. Lena returned to her room after dinner, closed the door, and stood with her back against it for a moment in the dark, before turning on the light. Then she picked up the new phone and called Phoebe. Her sister answered immediately, and the first thing Lena heard wasn't words but breathing. The kind of breathing that comes from someone who has been holding it in all day and is only now letting it go. Sis, Phoebe said, her voice shaking. Tell me everything, Lena told her. Not all of it, because there were parts she couldn't say over the phone even on a new line. But enough. She told her about the negotiation session, about Clause 9, about standing at the interpreting podium for the first time in 3 years and speaking the truth in 5 languages before 200 people. She told her the contract had been signed according to the original text. She didn't tell her about the Russian call behind the half-closed door or about the order to handle Calloway, because that was something she would keep to herself. Phoebe listened to all of it and then cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from sorrow, the kind that comes from relief, the kind that belongs to someone who loves another person very much and has been terrified for her, and now hears that she is all right, and everything bottled up breaks loose at once. Sis, Phoebe said through tears, I'm so proud of you. Lena closed her eyes. Thank you, she said. Then she promised to call again tomorrow, and ended the call. She set the phone down on the table by the window, sat in the chair where she had sat the night before while writing 4 pages in her notebook, and looked out at Washington at night, the pale white buildings blurred in the cold November mist. And for the first time in the last 24 hours, Lena allowed herself to cry. Not because of Bryce. She had been finished with Bryce from the moment she heard Phoebe say in the car the night before that the relationship had been an operation with a budget. People don't cry over operations. They cry over what those operations take away. She cried for 4 years. 4 years spent living inside a play she had mistaken for real life. 4 years waking every morning beside a man she thought loved her while he was being paid monthly to keep her away from the exact place she belonged. 3 years translating scraps of contracts for small law firms in Manhattan for fees that weren't enough to cover rent in Queens when she should have been standing in rooms like the one she stood in that afternoon, reading every clause in 6 languages for people who needed the truth delivered with absolute precision, down to the syllable. 3 years with her mother in a hospital in Brooklyn, while she scrambled to cover medical bills with an income deliberately cut down by the very man who held her every night and said, "You have me." The tears didn't last long, and they weren't many, because Lena wasn't a woman who cried for long. She cried just enough for the thing that had been pressed tight inside her chest since the night before at the port to find its way out. And then she stopped, because she knew tears had a function, and once that function was complete, continuing to cry became self-pity, and she had no time for that. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, stood up, washed her face, returned to the chair by the window, opened the notebook, turned past the 4 pages she had written the night before, past the pages of notes from the negotiation room that day, until she reached the first blank page. She wrote a single line in small capital letters, clear and centered in the middle of the page. Talent doesn't disappear when it is silenced. It waits. She looked at that sentence for a while. Then she closed the notebook, set down the pen, looked out the window where Washington lay still under a thin veil of mist, and somewhere far beyond it the Potomac kept moving through the night, unseen but there, never frozen, never stopping. Tomorrow she would call DOJ. Tomorrow she would send her contact information to the Italian delegation, the Russian delegation, the Arab delegation. Tomorrow there would be time for everything that was opening in front of her. But tonight she had finished crying, and that meant she was ready. Everything collapsed faster than it had taken to build it. Kirk Alderman gave up everything that very night, in a small windowless room in the basement of the federal building, sitting across from 2 oversight committee agents and an FBI representative called in from the Washington field office. He didn't talk out of remorse. He talked because Hendricks had taken 3 photographs: the red-marked notebook, the message screen on the tablet, and the sheet of instructions tucked beneath the notebook. And when his lawyer saw those 3 photographs, the only advice left to give was cooperate immediately in exchange for partial immunity. Kirk handed over names, handed over documents, handed over message history, handed over the list of 3 translation companies he was registered with, and all 3 had Petrov as their primary client over the last 18 months. He handed over the chain of instructions he had received for each negotiation session, which clauses were to be simplified, which were to be reversed, with specific payment amounts attached to every intentional mistranslation. Genevieve Harlan was suspended before that day was over. The Oversight Committee found 17 text exchanges on her phone with a burner number registered under the name of a shell company that Kirk had just confirmed belonged to Petrov's system. She didn't talk. She called a lawyer and stayed silent. But that silence didn't save her, because Kirk had already said enough, and Hendricks's 3 photographs said the rest. Bryce Ledger was summoned by the FBI 2 days later in New York. He wasn't arrested because there wasn't yet enough to charge him immediately, but he was compelled to appear as a witness in the investigation into the link between his consulting company and the Petrov network. 4 years of taking money, 4 years of blocking Lena's career, the anonymous complaint sent to DOJ, the contract he signed with Petrov 3 weeks after refusing the job on Lena's behalf. All of it was sitting on an FBI table in black ink on white paper with nowhere left to hide. And Thane Calloway did the rest. The part the press would never write and court records would never include. What Kirk gave investigators didn't go only toward the federal side. It also went to Hendricks. And from Hendricks, it went to places Lena didn't ask about and didn't need to know. Places where the financial arteries of Petrov's network ran beneath legitimate companies and were cut one vein at a time. Accounts shut down, partners pulled away, contracts canceled, not by court order but by midnight phone calls and meetings in rooms without nameplates. In a matter of weeks, Yulian Petrov lost what he had built over years, not from one single blow, but from 100 small cuts, placed exactly where they needed to be, the kind of destruction only someone who understood the system from the inside would know how to carry out. Lena knew it was happening. She wasn't stupid, and she didn't pretend not to see it, but she didn't ask. She told Thane on the final morning in Washington, before she flew back to New York, seated across from him in the hotel dining room, at the same corner table by the window where, 2 days earlier, he had slid the technical consultant badge across to her. There are questions that, if I ask them, the answers will change everything between us, she said. So I won't ask. Thane looked at her, longer than usual, not with judgment, with the look of a man who had just been shown that trust wasn't the same thing as knowing nothing, but knowing enough to understand where to stop. That's why I trust you, he said. Lena drank her coffee. Thane drank his. Outside the window, Washington was brightening under weak November sunlight, and somewhere in this city the system was doing its part, the law was doing its part, and Thane Calloway was doing his. And the line between those 2 worlds was the line Lena chose not to cross, because she understood that staying on the right side of it was the only way whatever existed between them could survive. Lena returned to New York the next morning. She took the 6 o'clock flight from Reagan National to LaGuardia with her notebook in her handbag and the new phone Hendricks had already set up with everything she needed. The first thing she did after setting foot back in Queens wasn't to go to her studio, but to Brooklyn Methodist to see her mother. Her mother was still in the older care unit, not transferred anywhere, and when she saw Lena walk in, She smiled with the smile of someone who didn't know her daughter had just lived through the 2 longest days of her life, but did know her daughter was here, and that was enough. Lena held her mother's hand and sat beside the bed for 30 minutes without saying much, because sometimes sitting beside each other is the fullest language there is, and it doesn't need translation. The week after that, she called DOJ. It wasn't the call she had planned. DOJ called her, because news from the Washington negotiation had reached exactly the people who needed to hear it, and the leadership of the Federal Interpreting Bureau wanted to meet her. The meeting took place in a 7th-floor conference room at DOJ headquarters, not in the windowless basement room where 3 years earlier she had signed a voluntary withdrawal at the advice of a man who was being paid every month to destroy her. This time she sat across from 3 people, and they didn't ask her to explain anything at all. They told her the internal investigation had reopened the anonymous complaint file from 3 years earlier, that the FBI had confirmed the source of that complaint came from Bryce Ledger's device, that she never should have been forced to leave, and they wanted her back, not in her old position, in a higher one, Chief of Interpretation for high-level security negotiations, the role she should have held long ago if no one had paid to keep her out of that chair. Lena looked at the 3 people across from her and thought about the windowless basement room, about Bryce's hand holding hers under the table, about the words, "You don't need them. You have me." Then she said, "I accept." 3 months later, she signed a contract with Callaway Holdings, on terms she proposed, not terms he offered, with the independence she required and the recognition she deserved. Thane read the contract she sent, didn't change a single line, signed it, and sent it back with a handwritten note on a small piece of paper that Lena kept inside her notebook to this day. The note held only one sentence: "The best clause I've ever signed." The night before Lena left Washington for the first time, in the Willard lobby near the elevators, Thane stopped. "Lena." She turned back. "What Bryce did wasn't just betrayal," he said. "It was a 4-year operation, and you broke it in 2 hours." Lena looked at him. 12 years, she corrected. 2 hours was only the last stretch. Thane nodded, and in that nod, Lena knew the man standing in front of her was someone who truly listened. Not the kind of listening meant to answer, but the kind meant to understand. The kind of listening she hadn't found in anyone for the last 4 years, because the person who should have listened to her was the one being paid to keep her silent. In the months that followed, they worked in different cities. New York, Washington, London, Dubai, Geneva. Different negotiation rooms, different contracts, different languages, but they built a rhythm that belonged only to them. A private language not contained in any of the 6 languages Lena spoke, yet understood by both. Written in short, handwritten notes, in document margins, in late-night calls when one of them needed to confirm a legal term, and the real reason for the call wasn't the term at all. In quiet pauses during meetings when their eyes met across the table, and no one needed to say anything because a slight nod was enough. And at some point, a day neither of them could point to exactly, they stopped needing to name what existed between them in order to know what it was, because some things, as the best interpreters understand, don't need to be translated. If this story touched you in any way, pause for a second and think about this. Every one of us carries a talent, a value, something only we truly understand the worth of. Sometimes life places us beside people who deliberately make us believe we are smaller than we really are. They can't take our talent, because they can't. They only take the tools we use to live it out. But talent doesn't disappear when it is silenced. It waits. It always waits. And when the right person appears, when the right door opens, it returns with more force than anyone ever expected. Lena's story is fictional, but the feelings inside it are real. Have you ever felt someone trying to keep you small? Have you ever doubted yourself because of the words of the person you trusted most? And have you ever, even once, stood up and realized you were stronger than the story someone else wrote for you? Share with us in the comments below. We read every comment, and we want to hear what's in the deepest part of your heart. If you enjoyed this story, please like and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.